So I spent 2 weeks very recently playing the entirety of Diablo 4 from front to end, and across a ton of other betas as well. So I've racked up a ton of time on the Necromancer, and I figured it would be valuable for me to sit down, collect all my thoughts, and basically tell you what I think of the class at this point. Is it too strong? Is it too weak? Does it need nerfs? Does it need buffs? What can you expect in the end game? I've tried to kind of put all this together into a single graph that I think really exemplifies my findings on the class, how I think it ranks up amongst itself, amongst the core 4 builds that I think generally exist, which would be Bone, Blood, Darkness, and Minion. And then in addition to that, or something that's coloring my evaluation of these 4 different archetypes, is how it fares against other people or in multiplayer settings, because a lot of Diablo 4 can be spent playing with other people, and you need to know whether or not your build can even keep up with them if you're going to be able to participate in the game. So I hope that this is something that helps you to get a better understanding, at the very least, of some of the great things about the Necromancer class that I think are incredibly well tuned, and some of the things that just quite aren't up to snuff. So before we get into the actual graph that I've arbitrarily generated that has a bunch of pictures to make it a little bit easier to be able to communicate, I want to talk about the core Necromancer experience, or at least the core Necromancer that I've experienced over the couple hundred hours that I've spent playing only this class. The Necromancer on paper has a ton of complexity to the class, and I think it's one of its more admirable traits. I think it's one of the parts of the class that is the most interesting. It has a lot of different ways to kind of build up a Megazord and create this very specially tuned functioning build, and it does particular things very well and may have some shortcomings, but it's doing exactly what you expect it to do. And in all of these regards, I consider Necromancer to have incredible depth of complexity, as well as incredible depth of fine-tuning and tinkering. The other side of that is that I think a ton of the options that you have really fall short as far as diversity is concerned. Something can be incredibly complex yet monochromatic, and I think that really describes the Necromancer to a T. It's something that you can sit down and brainstorm about, and you'll probably come up with 10 different paths that all lead down the same road to the same conclusion. I think that the Necromancer also has an incredible identity. It has very core aesthetics that go on to define what you expect those skills to do. Bone are physical manifestations of force, and as such they provide the biggest damage sources for the Necromancer as a whole. Blood literally deals with the life force or the vitality of monsters and people around you, and as such blood skills have a ton of ways of interacting with your health pool as well as survivability. Darkness skills quite literally obfuscate and obscure the world around you, and as such they bring a ton of crowd control options to the Necromancer's kit. And then the minions are a bunch of bumbling bags of bones that I wish would do anything at all. And I'm sorry for jumping straight to the cut, but I honestly believe that one of the places aesthetically and thematically that the Necromancer fails the most heavily is in minions, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. I don't want to start off the video on a down note that aggressively. And then lastly, obviously the Necromancer deals with death and decay, so your corpse and macabre skills bring an eerie goriness to the Necromancer as a whole, and you can feel that both in how important the corpse skills are to the Necromancer and how impossible it is to get away from them. So what I would like to do now is just jump over to this arbitrary graph that I've drawn that kind of gives you a representation of where the 4 archetypical builds fall in the important categories that I think are necessary for any class to be considered good or enjoyable in an action RPG. So right here we have our graphs. I'm looking at damage output, survivability, general gameplay feel, repetition of skill use, enjoyability falls into this category, and then group play. The colors are indicative of, again, the 4 archetypes that make themselves abundantly apparent in the quote-unquote build diversity of the Necromancer. So we have the dark gray bar representing the bone skills, we have purple bar representing the darkness skills, red bar representing the blood skills, and then the light blue bar representing minion based skills. And I'm going to be covering over group play during this because there's nowhere else to put my big head, but I will move back over when we're actually talking about that aspect of it. And for each one of these graphs, I'm going to kind of talk about them in reference to the Necromancer itself in a vacuum, and then in addition to that, the Necromancer in comparison to the other classes in the game. But when we start off with damage, there is no question the bone skills on the Necromancer output the most massive amounts of damage that's physically possible. When we're talking about the bone skills here, we're talking about Bone Spear as a spender and Bone Spirit as a spender. These are skills that require essence that do something when you use them, and you have to manage your essence to be able to continue to cast them. Bone Spear is an incredibly valuable skill and is absolutely the best leveling skill that the Necromancer has, and it exceeds or is on par with any other damage skill that you would find on other classes, and that's the surprising point. And incredibly important to note, only one of 2 skills that the Necromancer has that you can say that. The other Bone Spender, which is a later game option, is Bone Spirit. Second runner-up for damage and pretty comparable to Bone is actually the Darkness skills. While Corpse Explosion, the base skill, got nerfed into the ground after the open betas, the modifier for Corpse Explosion, which turns into a darkness damage over time skill, is one of the better damage scaling abilities that the Necromancer has because they all stack. So if there are 5 corpses on the ground, you cast Corpse Explosion 5 times, all 5 of them can be dealing damage to a target simultaneously. On top of that, the darkness skills have a ton of great options for increasing their damage and also have the strongest key passive or ultimate passive that the Necromancer has available to it, which is Shadow Blight. The only issue is that most of the shadow skills can't critically strike, and the Necromancer is actually one of the best classes for stacking critical strike on its build. And then when we're comparing shadow damage against other classes in the game, it gets a little bit tricky to really evaluate its damage output, but it definitely has one of the best continuous damage application engines out of any build. Blood builds for damage output should be a lot higher, and it's because the overpower mechanic should be a lot stronger. I think a lot of people got their hands on the overpower mechanic either in the level 20 or level 25 beta with the Necromancer, and at those points, overpower seems incredibly strong because it says take your entire life pool and all the fortify that you have, add that onto your damage, and add a bonus modifier, and that seems wicked strong. Except overpower damage isn't affected by critical strike in any way. And while your life pool is a big number in comparison to your damage early on, later on in the game, Necromancer around like level 60, level 70, only has about 2,000 life, and you can only generate fortify up to how much life you have, so that maxes out around 4,000 to 5,000. So now overpower adding on 4,000 or 5,000 flat damage really doesn't matter when my Bone Spirit at a similar point is critting for 170,000 damage. So blood feels pretty decent in the early game as far as damage is concerned, but later game completely falls off, and I'm not sure why they've hamstrung the overpower mechanic on a build whose entire purpose is to always overpower. Rathima's Vigor, the key passive, says that after 15 seconds of being healthy, your next skill will overpower. So if you have that all saved up and then you get hit by a big damage ability, you lose it. It's not like it leaves a buff on you. And then the other overpower abilities that blood skills have are also incredibly clunky, requiring you to cast multiple skills in a row, where Blood Surge has a huge essence cost, so it's only on the second round of casting it that you get the overpower, and Blood Lance is a trash skill. So realistically, all that blood has going for it is that Blood Surge hits the entire screen, and early on it feels okay. Minion builds are trash. I can't stress this enough. I don't understand why they hate the minion builds to the rate that they do. They don't do damage. You can't focus your minions on a target. They're incredibly fragile, and even putting in all of the points that you can into a minion build is only 25 total skill points on the skill tree. Not only that, a lot of the skills that you have target individual types of minions, so only golem minions or only skeletal minions, and then there are aspects that go on to exacerbate this issue where only your golem gets a benefit or only your skeletons gain damage, and then even further, the Paragon boards that are available also specify skeletons or golems in the majority of their bonus stats. So now you're needing to put a ton of points across a lot of different areas to individually empower specific summons, and they all fall over like wet tissue paper. And again, you can't direct them other than the golem. So you need to run into the melee to get your minions to surge ahead of you to initiate combat. They're just incredibly bad. The AI gets stuck all of the time. Shadow mages will actually attack over barriers because they can see the monster, but then their bolts are interrupted by those same barriers, and they don't do any type of hit registering, so they don't move. All of this leads up to the fact that while early on a lot of people thought that minions overperformed, they just hadn't seen how bad it gets yet, and in the end game, skeletal builds or minion builds in general are just non-existent, except in the case of utility or vague amounts of survivability, and even in those scenarios they underperform, but we'll get to those later. For survivability, Bone still ranks pretty high because one of the best defenses you can have is a good offense, and quite frankly, a lot of the Bone builds will snipe and one-shot monsters before they ever have a time to become a threat, and even on boss monsters, since this is how you output the best damage possible, you need to survive through less mechanics or AoE attacks because you're killing the boss before they can kill you. So in these regards, Bone is incredibly durable. So all in all, Bone is typically surviving by killing things first, but even in the situations where it's a long drawn out fight, it's doing an amazing job. Against other classes, Bone's survivability really kind of falls down the drain because other classes are just able to generate Fortify at a much better rate than they are, able to generate Barrier at a much better rate than they do, and even output more damage in certain scenarios, or at least less complex systems for putting out their damage. So it definitely begins to fall off when you compare it to other classes, but all in all, if you're on a Bone build, you're probably doing pretty well. Darkness is actually our best survivability build, which absolutely should confuse you because Blood is kind of earmarked as a poster child of survivability on the Necromancer, but it just kind of doesn't get there. Darkness, on the other hand, is able to apply a ton of crowd control to the entirety of the screen, and if there's anything that's going to make you survive, it's stunning every monster so that they can't attack you. On top of that, Darkness also has a really good output of overall damage, so while you're crowd controlling, you're also picking off threats at really good rates. Blood is able to generate a ton of Fortify and a ton of Barrier if you get a single unique set of pants called Temerity, which says that when you overheal, you generate Barrier. And for whatever reason, Blood is supposed to be this like massive tanky build. You're in the melee front lines, draining life out of anybody. You have Blood Mist, which every single Necromancer build uses because it's our only unstoppable skill, but that's a whole other discussion. And you have all these ways of fortifying. The problem being that you don't do any damage, and when you're done dealing out your damage, most monsters aren't dead, especially in the end game. So in a lot of scenarios, Blood would be a phenomenal defensive and survival based build if it could actually kill anything. And I even think that my evaluation of this thing being around like a 6 or 7 is overinflated, just because I had recently, at the end of the press release that we just got done with, come up with a Blood summon build that at least there were other targets for the monsters to attack that weren't me. But since your minions can't target towards a specific threat or a specific monster, and monsters aren't forced to attack anything other than specifically the Bone Golem when it uses its taunt activated ability, even that build is going to die because it can't output enough damage to be able to survive anything higher than like tier 20 or 30 Nightmare Dungeons. So I actually think that Blood's evaluation is a little bit too high here, and then in comparison to other builds, it falls completely short. Then for survivability, the only reason why a minion based build isn't set to 0 is because they do have the Bone Golem and it can taunt monsters for a little bit of time. On top of that, the Blood Golem is actually like a pretty decent option for survivability because he is just so tanky himself, and he also has another targeted ability that forces him to run up and deal a bunch of damage, which tends to get the attention of monsters that you're fighting. For overall gameplay, Bone really excels because it is just so damn fun and so interactive and so rewarding. I hate repeating myself that much, but it's just across the board incredibly fun. It has a lot of different avenues by which to have its essence generation engine going. You can utilize corpse explosion, which is probably like the prototypical version of it. There's this really awesome way of using bone prison and blight to generate a ton of umbral procs, which generates a ton of resource, does a whole bunch of crowd control, and then you use that as your mana battery. So you have all of these different engines that you can pick from to be able to empower your gameplay, and then you have a lot of different options for how you want to go about doing it. I actually had a bone build where I used Bone Spear and Bone Spirit, so I would use Bone Spear to set up vulnerability and then Bone Spirit to blow everything away. And on that build, I didn't even use Blood Mist, which I recommend putting onto every single Necromancer. The point I'm trying to hammer on here is that Bone, which should be incredibly simple, has some of the most diverse and complex combinations of aspect skills and Paragon tree options that allow you to kind of Frankenstein together this build to do the exact type of gameplay that you're looking for. You can be completely ranged, you can be a close combatant, you can get right up into the face of bosses, you can stand away and just wait for the Bone Spirit nuke to go off in the distance. There are so many ways of playing the game, and every single encounter feels a little bit different because it also requires you to understand geometry and reflecting bone spears. Shadow damage does one thing. It generates a corpse, and then it casts corpse explosion, and then that generates more corpses, which you explode to do more miasma clouds to generate more corpses. And then if you have a tanky monster, you either gun it down with blight, which is basically just like a small corpse explosion, or you gun it down with sever, which is like a bad version of corpse explosion, but it's still kind of decent enough to output damage, and it looks cool because you summon a Grim Reaper that attacks 4 times. And while all that might be personally cool to you, the gameplay of it is incredibly repetitive, going over and over again, playing out the exact same way every single time. You really don't make decisions. You cast corpse tendrils on a corpse that you make with your reap skill, and then you cast corpse explosion while everything's getting pulled in. Everything gets hit, generates more corpses, you cast more corpse explosions, everything dies, and you can't even see the screen because the miasma effect is so dense that it completely obfuscates the entire screen and even your character, and even dangers on the ground like elite monsters casting like damage AoE on the ground. It makes it really hard to play the game, and I actually had to turn on player outline just to be able to have a chance to actually see where I was on the screen. So all in all, while the gameplay is effective, it's very boring and it's single faceted. There's really not a lot of dimensions to it. Blood gameplay is even worse than that because you are perpetually falling behind the ball of having enough essence to keep casting your blood skills. On trash minions, every single skill in the game will one-shot them. You can't make a build that can't one-shot trash mobs, and that's where blood builds feel the best. Blowing up the entire screen with Blood Surge or having enough individual targets spaced out to be able to gun them all down with Blood Lance. But the moment that you're facing everything that doesn't die to 1 to 2 casts of Blood Surge or emptying your entire Essence Orb of Blood Lance, you are running around panicking, trying to generate enough Essence to cast more. Blood Wave is actually the worst ultimate skill that the Necromancer has because it flies out, deals a little bit of damage, knocks things back, and applies a slow, which doesn't even crowd control monsters as much as you might think it would. Blood Mist is another skill that just feels incredibly terrible to use, but you have to do it. When a monster walks up to you and crowd controls you, you Blood Mist, and then you kind of very slowly move away from those monsters where they're able to track to you the entire time. So there are a ton of like slapstick moments where I Blood Misted away from an incredibly dangerous monster, and they all just followed me, and then when I got out of Blood Mist, they all just one-tapped me anyways. I would rate it lower, but it was kind of funny every single time that it happened. And when you're trying to use it as like part of a blood build, you realize that it doesn't really do anything at all. Honestly, the blood skills are just like so anticlimactic, they're so underwhelming, and they do so little to morph the battlefield around you that the gameplay suffers at a precipitous rate when it really shouldn't, because the blood skills together have a really cool combination of things that they can do, but everything that they do is so subpar that it never feels like you're gaining any traction in a fight. And then ironically enough, summon builds for gameplay are a lot of fun because it's just like playing dominoes and checkers and Yahtzee and Jenga all at the same time. You're constantly trying to get them into position to do different things. The mages are doing different stuff. The skeletons are just running around dying. Your golem's running from one side of the battlefield trying to save you, running over to the other side of the battlefield to try and save you. And the ways that you can build minion builds, like a blood minion build, gives them a little bit more utility, a little bit more survivability, and then feels a bit more interactive. Or if you're trying to be like a darkness summon build, which is actually the probably the best way to do a summon build is either do Sever summons or Blight summons. And it's basically just because the Shadow build can carry so hard, and then the minions give you something to do during the battle that isn't just casting Corpse Explosion. And that's honestly very fun. It's very fun to kind of like handling all of it or managing all of it or keeping all the plates spinning if that's a rewarding gameplay style for you. The reason why it suffers so much is very similar to blood builds. It kind of doesn't do anything. Like, I promise you, it's not that I just had a bad experience with summons and couldn't find a way to make them work. They just don't work. Even if you fully invest in them, like wholly fully invest in them, they just cannot survive in nightmare dungeons. They just can't. They will just walk up and will just get one shot by anything that's bigger than a base minion. And then you have group play. And you might wonder, well, if the Bone Spirit and the Bone Spirit build are able to output some of the biggest damage in the game, why isn't this also a 10 out of 10? And it's because the Necromancer can't keep up with other classes. And this is going to go for every single build that I talk about, so I really want to hammer on it here. For whatever reason, the developers believe that the Necromancer should be balanced around the fact that they don't move fast. The only skill that the Necromancer has to gain movement speed is Reaper's Pursuit, which says when you deal shadow damage, you gain 5 up to 15% movement speed for a short period of time. I do not understand why the developers believe that the Necromancer should have access to no mobility skills. And you might say, well, you can get mobility on your boots and you can get mobility on your amulet, and then you can put on Wind Striker so you gain mobility when you crit, and every other class can also do that and will also do that. So at the end of the day, the Necromancer has no way to gain better than that amount of movement speed like every other class, and it also takes up slots that you might want to use for survivability or additional damage. This is my plea. This is my most sought after change to the Necromancer. Let them have mobility. Make the Blood Wave ultimate give you mobility because it invigorates your body. Allow Bone Storm to give you mobility because it's spinning around you like a cyclone and speeding you up. Let Army of the Dead give you mobility because you jump on the back of your golem and you can run at 50% movement speed. Other than Bone Storm, all of the other ultimate abilities, the other two ultimate abilities that the Necromancer have are complete trash. But if they said movement speed, I would put them on every single Necromancer build that I could. That I'm not being sarcastic here. I'm not being like over dramatic. The lack of movement speed on the Necromancer is disgusting. I think it's an incredible oversight as far as class balance is concerned. In this game, mobility is the greatest total multiplier for overall efficiency, farming, PvP, endgame content out there. And for whatever reason, they decide the Necromancer can't have any. So keeping all of that in mind, all of the Necromancer builds would feel infinitely better in group play and dungeon pushing if they could physically keep up with their team, but they cannot. I'm not joking. While the Barbarian can use shouts that'll also give you movement speed, they have their own innate movement speed buffs. The Rogue has their own innate movement speed buffs. Even the Druid, that doesn't have a ton of mobility, at least has a bunch of dashes that it can use. And the Sorceress can teleport and increase its speed with a bunch of lightning skills. The Necromancer physically cannot keep the other characters on screen long enough for it to actually participate in group play until you get to the boss at the end of the dungeon and you're forced to teleport past the wind wall to actually engage them. Sorry for the huge tirade, but it's really important for people to understand that when they get on the Necromancer, you're not doing something wrong. It's not that you mess something up. They just don't have movement speed. With that in mind, Bone Spear and Bone Spirit or Bone builds in general can typically feel very good in gameplay because you can apply so much damage to targets that you maintain your relevance against tankier monsters and bosses. Not only that, you can also apply vulnerable basically at will, and the rest of the skills on your kit have an amazing amount of crowd control with pixel pulls from corpse tendrils and on blight with certain aspects and on bone prison. So you really bring a lot to the table as far as buffing your team's damage, increasing their survivability, and outputting your own damage. Darkness skills at least can kind of keep up a little bit well, and you still apply an incredible amount of crowd control. But ultimately, the Necromancer's damage really pales in comparison to the rest of the other classes other than on bone skills. And because of that, your ability to contribute to fights is a lot smaller. Now, if there were like more prolonged or drawn out fights where monsters didn't take as much damage, so being able to like manage them and crowd control them was more important, darkness skills would feel incredibly good in gameplay scenarios. But that's just not the case right now, at least for the content that we've seen. So in all of these scenarios, while you're applying a ton of crowd control, most of the monsters are dead long before you get there. Blood builds handle all of the same things I just said, except they also don't do damage, they don't have any mobility buffs, and they have even less crowd control options. So all in all, while they still have some of the utility options like using corpse tendrils, the rest of what they do is just like nothing, and they don't really apply anything else to the group play that you'd really want. And then minions get a 0 out of 0. They're just bad. You're not a shadow build, so you can't keep up. You're not a bone build, so you can't do damage. And you're not a blood build, so you can't even survive long enough to get the rewards at the end of the dungeon. That's it. I actually don't have like any like great insights here. The only thing that you got going for you, again, is your golem that can apply a taunt. And other than that, you're just not functional in the end game, and you don't have any way to keep up with your teammates, and you don't apply damage even when you do get there. So all in all, 0 out of 0, would not recommend. Now, I know a lot of that got very dour, and I'm sorry. It's my honest opinion about the class. It's honestly the experience that I've had playing it, how I felt piloting it, and how I've felt rewarded for the amount of time that I put into the class. Without question, the most fun that I have had has been on bone builds, because as long as I'm not comparing myself to other classes, you feel like an absolute god. You shatter the game around you. Where a lot of builds kind of have to choose between doing single target damage or doing multiple target damage, bone builds just do it all. They explode everything, they blow up everything. They're also able to slot in the Miasma Corpse explosion to gain a little bit of mobility. They're able to use Reap to generate a little bit of mobility. They can also generate a ton of crowd control and stun, which is like really important for the overall efficiency of the build. They have so many different ways to combine aspects to really customize the build to do very important or special things that other ones just can't. And if I were to recommend any singular build for you to play, it is to level up as Bone Spear and then transition into Bone Spirit. Feel free to comment down below with how you feel about the Necromancer, especially after you get your hands on it and you've been playing it for a little bit. Hopefully, I'm bringing as much information about the Necromancer that I possibly can to the public so that you all can get that head start, or at least be in a better place when you start playing the game and be as prepared as you can. So again, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.